Welcome to this DAX for Power BI tutorial. In this video we're going to be covering how to use the if function. We'll begin with a look at how to write basic if expressions and logical tests, and use those to create some calculated columns that you could use in your report visuals as either category fields or value fields. Then we'll look at how you can nest expressions inside your if functions to make your logical tests a bit more sophisticated, and also how you can nest an if function inside an if function to expand the number of answers you can get out of it. We'll show you how to use both the AND function and AND operator, and then the OR function and OR operator to combine multiple conditions in the same logical test. Towards the end of the video, we'll explain how you can use the IN operator to combine multiple OR conditions in a slightly more succinct way. It's quite a lot to do in this one. Let's get started. To get started, I've created a new report, and the first thing we'll do in here is import some data from an Excel workbook. As usual, I have several choices for how I can do that. I'm going to click the Excel workbook button up here on the home tab of the ribbon. I'll import my standard list of movies, and again I'll drop a link in the video description so you can download this file yourself. I'll double click on the file, and then when the import wizard loads, I should find a single worksheet called Movies. I can check the box next to that, click the load button, and that data will then be imported. When that's finished, just so that we can see the results of the calculated columns we're going to create in this video, we'll switch into the data view by clicking the data button on the left hand side, and then we'll get ready to start creating our calculated columns. For the first example, I'd like to create a column which lets us categorise our films based on the value of Oscar wins. So I'm going to describe my film as either a winner or a loser, depending on whether the Oscar wins value is 0 or not. It's a fairly harsh system, I'll admit, but hey, that's life in Hollywood. It's a harsh and unforgiving place. So let's get started by clicking on the New Column button to create our new column. And then just so you can see what I'm typing, I'm going to zoom in on the formula bar by holding down the Control key and rolling the mouse wheel forwards. Remember, if you don't have a mouse wheel, you can hold down the Control key and press the equals key to zoom in if you need to. We'll change the name of the column. Column's a fairly boring, uninventive name, much like my other column names. Let's call this one Oscar Success. And then after the equals operator, we can begin our if function. And the simplest way to do that is to type in the letter I, which will highlight the if function in the IntelliSense list. And then you can press the tab key to type in the rest of the function and expose the tooltip telling you how the function works. So from this we can tell that the if function has three parameters: logical test, result if true, and a third optional parameter. We know that it's optional because it's listed in square brackets, result if false. I'd like to write my logical test on the next line in the formula bar. So to throw a new line, remember you must hold down the Shift key and press Enter. Don't just press Enter by itself, because that will enter your entire formula at that point and inevitably tell you you've got it wrong and force you to edit it before you can do anything else. So a logical test is just a statement that could be either true or false. So I'm going to make the statement that the Oscar wins column for any particular row is equal to the value of 0. So I'll start referring to my Oscar wins column by starting to type in the word Oscar, and then if I hit tab when my column name is highlighted to type in the rest of that reference, and then state that that is equal to 0. I'm then going to type in a comma and then Shift and Enter to move on to the result if true parameter. So if that logical test is true, I want to return the word loser. In DAX we must enclose text in double quote characters, so in some double quotes, write the word loser. Now I don't technically have to provide a value for the result if false parameter. I could just close my round brackets here and press Enter to create my formula. In fact, let's do that. I'm going to press Shift and Enter and then close the round brackets and then Enter by itself to create my formula. And that will work. And you'll see that for any films whose Oscar wins is 0, they're described as losers, rightfully so. If I scroll down far enough, you'll find that when we hit the films that do have Oscar wins, we've returned a blank, the equivalent of null if you're familiar with nulls in SQL. I'd prefer to provide a description for films which have won some Oscars. So I'm going to click back into my formula bar. I'm going to type a comma after the word loser, press Shift and Enter, and then on the next line, type in the word winner in some double quotes. I can then press enter again to update my formula, and this time we'll see that when we hit the films that do have some Oscars, they're now described as winners. Now, of course, the point of creating extra calculated columns in your data model is so you can use them in some visuals in the report. So let's just take a brief moment to head back to the report view by clicking on the report button in the top left-hand corner, and I'm going to build a basic chart to display the average runtime of films in different genres divided up into winners and losers. So I'm going to begin by creating a clustered column chart. I'm just going to collapse the filters panel just to give a little more room to design my chart. I'll resize it so it fills the full screen, and then I'm going to check the box next to the genre column in the fields list to add that to the axis bucket. Then we'll add in the runtime field to the values bucket by checking the box next to that. I don't want the sum of runtime, I prefer to have the average, so clicking on the drop down arrow next to the runtime field in the values bucket, I can switch that to say average. Finally, I'm then going to find my Oscar success field, and I'm going to drag that into the legend bucket. So I can drag Oscar success into the legend, and that will automatically divide each genre into losers and winners according to the results of our if function. So we've used the if function to create a category column that we can use to slice our data up into different groups. But we can also use the if function to create value columns. For the next example, we're going to calculate a tax for each film based on the value of the box office column. So it's a fairly harsh and unforgiving system yet again. If the value of box office is at least $1 billion, we're going to collect 20% of that figure as tax. Otherwise, we'll only collect 10%. So to make that work, let's create a new column back in the data view. What should we call this column? We could call it tax. We could call it DAX tax. No, that's a silly name. Let's not call it DAX tax. Let's just call it tax. I can't bring myself to type in DAX tax, but it's going to use the if function again. So type in the letter I after the equal sign, press the tab key to type in the rest of the function name and open the round brackets. Then shift and enter, and I'm going to start typing in the word box for box office. Hit the tab key to type in the rest of that column name when it's highlighted, and then I want to check if it's greater than or equal to 1 billion. So I have to count out the number of zeros I type in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, then I can type in a comma, and then on the next line, if I press shift and enter, I don't just want to present some text this time, I want to perform another calculation. So I'd like to multiply the value of the box office column by 20% or 0.2. So I can do that by saying box office multiplied by, and then if you're familiar with Excel, you may be familiar with typing in things like 20%, so you can actually type that into your formula. That doesn't work in DAX. In DAX, we need to use the underlying decimal value for 20%, so 0.2. Then I can type in another comma, shift and enter, go for the box office column again, and multiply that by 0.1 for 10%. Shift and enter, close the round brackets, press enter to create the formula. So just to try to demonstrate that this is working correctly, it's a little trickier to see than the basic example we've just done there. If we sort our box office column in descending order, so we can click on the drop down arrow at the top of the box office column, sort in descending order, we'll hopefully see that any film whose box office is at least $1 billion, we collect 20% of that figure. But for any film whose box office is under $1 billion, we only collect 10%. When you've created a calculated column you want to use as a value in a visual, there are a couple of settings you might like to change before you start using it in the report view. So for example, with the tax column selected, we could apply a default format to that column using the formatting part of the Column Tools tab of the ribbon. So I'm going to change the formatting here to $English United States. I could also choose to apply a default summarization. So when I add this column to a visual, rather than automatically summing that column, I want this to be averaged instead. So for the summarization option, choose average. then if I head back to the report view, we could simply replace the values column in our chart, or the values field in our chart, from average of runtime. Let's get rid of that. I'm going to drag the tax field into the values bucket instead, and that will show us the average tax generated for losers and winners for the different genres of films. So far, our logical tests have been based on the value of a column, but you can also base your logical tests on the result of an expression that you nest inside the if function. So just to demonstrate that, let's change our tax system so that it's not based on the gross box office value, it's based on the profit that the film makes. So we're going to calculate the net by subtracting the budget from the box office. Just to show you that you can change your expressions for your calculated columns in the report view, let's just highlight the tax column from the fields list by clicking on it, and that will expose the formula bar. I'll have to zoom in again because the zoom level for the data view and the report view are different, so I'll just zoom in by holding the control key and rolling the mouse wheel forwards. So I'd like to modify the expression movies box office to say movies box office minus movies budget. And then I want to calculate 20% of the tax on that expression and 10% of the tax on that expression. So I don't want to have to repeat myself when I've edited the expression. A neat little trick with the DAX expression editor. If I click at the beginning of line 2 and then hold down the Alt key on my keyboard and click in the same position on the subsequent 2 lines, I get 3 active text cursors, and if I begin typing, if I open up some round brackets for example, that same character gets typed in on all 3 lines. I can then reposition the cursor using the arrow keys on my keyboard, and then after where it says box office, I can type in a space, then a minus symbol and another space, and then I can start looking for the budget column. Now, one small downside of this little feature is that the IntelliSense doesn't quite work as well as it should. So I don't get any help from the IntelliSense to insert my columns. So I'm going to have to type in movies, open some square brackets, budget, and then close the square brackets, and finally close the round brackets. So the same expression now nested on each line in each parameter of my if function. If I simply press enter at that point, that will update the expression, and you hopefully saw the chart updating its values in the background there as well. So, nesting expressions inside your if function. Now, as well as nesting basic expressions like this inside your if functions, you can also nest entire if functions inside your if functions. And that's useful whenever you want to provide more than just 2 possible answers. So to demonstrate how this works, let's head back to our fairly unfair Oscar success if function. I think it's a little unfair to describe a film a loser if it could not have even won an Oscar. So if it hadn't received any nominations, we should maybe describe it as a not nominated film. And then only if it received at least 1 nomination could we divide it into losers and winners. Now we can arrange this combination of if functions in lots of different ways. I'm going to put this entire if function that we've currently created inside the false part, the answer if false argument of another if function. So after my equal sign at the beginning of this expression, I'm going to type in if, or at least I again, hit the tab key to insert another if function. Then I'm going to press Shift and Enter a couple of times to move this if function downwards. And then in the blank line I have for line number 2, I'm going to test a different condition. So I want to check the nominations column. So I'll start typing in nominations, highlight movies nominations, and then ask if that is equal to 0. I'll then type in a comma, press Shift and Enter. And if that condition happens to be true, I want to describe the film as not nominated. So it couldn't even have won an Oscar, and I'll spell it correctly eventually. There we go. Then I'm going to type in a comma, which moves me on to the result if false parameter of the outer if function. When we reach that parameter, I want to then check if the Oscar wins value is equal to 0. So we're only going to reach this stage here. We'll only evaluate this condition if the movie's nominations is not equal to 0. just to tidy up the layout, I'm going to highlight all of these lines of code from lines 5 down to 8 and hit the tab key to indent them all one space, so that entire if function is at the same tab level. And then I'll need one additional closed round bracket symbol to go along with the outer if function, so I'll press Shift and Enter at the end and close another set of round brackets. Okay, so having done that, we can press Enter or click our tick to update our expression, and once again we should see in the background that we've now generated a new result for the Oscar success column, and that's replicated in the chart with the new not nominated category. Next, I'd like to show you that you can combine multiple conditions in the same logical test. And to demonstrate that, we're going to create another column that describes a film's performance in more general terms, not just based on the Oscar wins or nominations. So I'd like to describe a film as a high-performing film if it made at least $1 billion at the box office and it received at least 3 Oscar nominations. So to do that, let's head back to the data view this time, and I'm going to create a new column by clicking the New Column button. And let's call this new column, let's call it Performance, or General Performance, I suppose. I'm going to write an if function again, so type in the letter I, hit Tab, followed by Shift and Enter, and then I want to combine 2 conditions in the same logical test. I've got a couple of ways I can do this, and for this example, I'm going to use a new function called AND. So if I start typing in the word AND, I can then hit the Tab key to insert that, and you'll see that in the tooltip I can add 2 separate logical tests in the 2 separate parameters, and if every single one of those logical tests returns true, the entire function returns true. So my first logical test, let's hit Shift and Enter to head down to the next line. I want to check if the box office column has a value that is at least 1 followed by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 zeros. Then I can type in a comma and then Shift and Enter. And then I want to check if the nominations column contains a value that is at least 3, so greater than or equal to 3. I can then close the round brackets, type in a comma, Shift and Enter, and if both of those conditions are true, I'd like to call the film a high-performing film or a high performance. Let's just write the word high, it's much easier to type. Then I'll type in a comma, Shift and Enter, and let's call this normal, and then one more close round brackets to close the if function off. If we then press Enter, we'll see we get a new column, and any high-performing film must have met both conditions. So nominations must be 3 or more, and box office must be $1 billion or more. So the AND function is great, providing we only want to combine 2 separate logical tests. But what if we wanted to add a third? I don't think we can really call a film a high-performing film if it didn't actually win any Oscars. So I think we should add a third condition to make sure that we received at least 1 Oscar win. Now there's no way to do that inside this current AND function. If I click at the end of the AND function there, you can see it's run out of parameters after the second one. If I typed in a comma, there are no more parameters to fill in. So I suppose we could nest AND functions inside AND functions if we wanted to expand on this, but that gets a little bit messy, and I think there's an easier solution, although not a particularly obvious one, I think. So I'm going to start by getting rid of the AND function. Let's just get rid of the AND and the open round brackets and bring our first logical test back to line number 2. Then I'm also going to get rid of the closed round bracket corresponding to the end of the AND function and bring the comma back to the end of the second logical test. Then let's just get rid of that tab level there as well. So at the moment it looks like I'm trying to specify 4 different parameters for the if function, and that certainly won't work. So what I need to do now is make sure that the comma in between the 2 logical tests is removed and replaced with the AND operator, which in DAX is the double ampersand symbol. So as long as this condition is true and this condition is true, then we'll return the word high. Now the great thing about this is I can combine as many different logical tests as I like using AND operators. So after the second logical test, I can type in double ampersand, and then on the next line, let's go for Oscar wins and check that that is at least equal to 1, and I could carry on going there. Anyway, that's enough for me. I think if I press enter to update that expression, we'll now see we've reduced the number of films which are described as high-performing ones to only those which match all 3 conditions. We have similar options if we want to combine multiple conditions on an OR basis. And to demonstrate that, let's try to help our users to avoid terrible movies in our list. I want to classify a terrible movie as one which either has a genre of awful or a director of Michael Bay. Sorry, Michael Bay fans, feel free to substitute Michael Bay for another terrible director of your choice. J.J. Abrams. Anyway, whoever you choose, we'll use their name for this example. So let's create a new column. I'm going to call this one, what should we call it? Let's call it recommendation, or Weisal's recommendation, equals if, and then on the next line, to begin with, we'll use the OR function. So this operates just like the AND function. If I say OR, I've got 2 separate logical tests to insert. So the first logical test I want to check is the genre field equal to the word awful. Now, comparing strings like this in DAX isn't case sensitive, so I can write awful with a lowercase a and still successfully return a result. I can then type in a comma, and then on the next line, let's refer to the director field and check if that is equal to your own personal least favourite director. So I'm going to go for Michael Bay. And then I can close the round brackets for the OR function, type in a comma, and then on the next line, I'm going to provide a recommendation of avoid, and then another comma, and then I can't guarantee that the film will be watchable, but it's probably safe to watch. So let's give it a cautious recommendation of probably safe. I can then close the round brackets for the if function and then hit enter to find my recommendation. Many probably safe films, but there's a Michael Bay movie to avoid and another one. And if we just want to see all of the films to avoid, we could sort the avoid or the recommendation column in ascending order, and all of the movies to avoid will sit at the top of that list. Just as with the AND function, the OR function is limited to just 2 logical tests. So if you want to combine more than 2 conditions using an OR, then you need to use the OR operator rather than the function. So let's do the same as we did with the AND function. We'll get rid of the OR function and then get rid of the close round brackets at the end and take the comma back to the previous line, get rid of that extra tab space, and then we can replace the comma in between our 2 logical tests with the OR operator, which are the 2 vertical bar symbols or the pipes. So again, I could combine multiple conditions with multiple OR operators, just as we did with AND, but I'm going to keep this one to just the 2, press enter to update the expression and get the same end results. Now I feel that I've been a little bit harsh on Michael Bay here, because not every single one of his films is absolutely dreadful, just most of them, but things like The Rock and Bad Boys 2 are quite watchable, so I'd like to modify our condition a little bit to only consider films directed by Michael Bay in the science fiction genre. These are the ones that tend to be pretty dreadful. Oh, and Pearl Harbor, of course, that's unequivocally awful at all times, so maybe we should avoid that one as well. But I want to add an extra criterion to this condition. If a film is directed by Michael Bay and it's in the science fiction genre, then it should be avoided. Or if the movie is in the awful genre at all times. We all know to avoid Twilight movies, that's just generally good advice for life. So let's expand on our conditions a little bit. I'm going to add an open round bracket in front of the condition that checks if the director is equal to Michael Bay. When you're combining multiple combinations of ands and ors, it's always worthwhile wrapping round brackets around the combinations of criteria you want to evaluate together. So if the film is directed by Michael Bay and in the science fiction genre, then it's to be avoided. So I've got movie director equals Michael Bay. Then on the same line, I'm going to say double ampersand, movies genre equals, and then go for science fiction. I'm going to run out of space on that line. Let's just zoom out a little bit so we can get everything onto a single line. Hopefully that's still readable for you as well. So I've closed the round brackets there. I think there's one more thing we should do. I want to check that the film's title equals Pearl Harbor. So I've got movie genre equals awful, or the director is Michael Bay and the genre is science fiction, and then one more or operator, if I add another double vertical bar. And then I'm going to check that the movie's title equals Pearl Harbor. I've got to spell that incorrectly because for some bizarre reason they've spelt it without the U. Anyway, there we go. So having done all that, let's click the tick or press enter, and we should get a modified list of movies to avoid, but it means that things like The Rock and Bad Boys you can now safely watch according to Wise Owl's recommendation. For the final example, let's be a little more positive. I'd like to create a column to label any film made by one of our favourite directors, and we can choose multiple different directors for this example. I'll start by creating a new column, and then what should we call this one? Let's call this one Fave Directors or something along those lines. And I'll start by saying equals if, and then to begin with I'm going to use the or operator to check if the director field equals one director's name, then a different director's name, and so on. So to begin with, let's refer to the director column and check if it's equal to, and I'm going to start by looking for Christopher Nolan. And then at the end of that, I can type in my or operator, the double vertical bars. And then because the next line is going to be essentially identical to this one, just with a different name, rather than typing the whole thing out again, I can hold down the Shift key and the Alt key and tap the down arrow key on the keyboard to duplicate the line that my cursor is on. I can then change the name, so I can go for, let's go for Edgar Wright next time. And then I can go to the end of that line and I can hold down Shift and Alt again and tap the down arrow key. And then finally, I'm going to check for Joel Cohen. Of course, feel free to use your own list of director names. It really doesn't matter for this example. I'm going to get rid of the double vertical bars because I don't want to check any more conditions, and then type in a comma, Shift and enter. And then on the next line, let's, how should we categorize this or label this? Let's call it favorite. And then another comma, and then normal, standard, non-favourite. Pick a word that indicates no particular preference, I suppose. I'm going to go for the word standard. Then finally, I can close the round brackets, hit enter to create my formula. And again, if I just sort this list so that I can see the favourites at the top, I can sort in ascending order. Those are all of the favourite films according to any of the directors whose names I've listed. So this example works quite nicely, we get the result we want, but it is a bit long-winded to write, and there's a much more succinct way we could do this same thing. Whenever you're referring to the same column in multiple logical tests and checking if the value of that column is equal to one of several different values, you can replace these individual logical tests with a single in operator. Now this is something that people coming from an SQL background will probably be fairly familiar with. So after the first, or instead of the first equals operator, I'm going to write the word in, and then after that I'm going to open up a set of braces or curly brackets. Then I'm just going to take Christopher Nolan down to the next line by pressing Shift and enter, and I'll get rid of that extra space in front of my cursor there. Then instead of the or operator, I can replace that with a comma. And then on the next line, I can get rid of the movie's director equals. I'll just indent Edgar Wright there, and then have a comma there after Edgar Wright. And then on the next line, get rid of movie's director equals, replaced with Joel Cohen. And then finally, I need to give myself another new line and close the curly brackets or the braces. So if the value of the director column is in this list of values, it will generate the word favourite, otherwise it will generate the word standard. And if I press enter, I'll end up with the exact same end results. And that means once again, now that we've created all these extra columns, we could head back to the report view and we could start adding those columns into our visualizations. So just a very quick, simple example, I'm going to get rid of the Oscar success from the legend box and find my Fave Directors field, drop that into the legend box and see which genres and how much tax we generate from films directed by my favourite directors. So there you go, there's the basics of using the if function to create calculated columns in DAX. In the next video we're going to continue the theme of logical tests using a different function called switch. So I hope you're looking forward to that one. Thanks very much for watching and we'll see you next time.